Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Robin Dwyer. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories. Foreign Minister Wang Yi says China wants to be a force for peace, but says the world's inability to stop the bloodshed in Gaza is a disgrace for civilization. Wang Yi also calls for more cooperation with the European Union, describing the bloc as a partner rather than a competitor. Hopes for a Ramadan ceasefire in Gaza fade as Cairo talks come to an end. Hamas and Israel blame each other for the stalemate. And China opens its doors to more visitors as it scraps entry requirements for 4 more countries. Foreign Minister Wang Yi says China sees itself as a force for peace and stability in the world, despite the current global turmoil. Wang Yi was speaking in Beijing on the sidelines of the 2 sessions, where he touched on relations with the United States and the European Union. But his strongest comments were delivered on the 5-month-long conflict in Gaza. Wang said the world's inability to stop the bloodshed was a tragedy for humanity and a disgrace for civilization. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Penina Karibe, who's in Beijing. So, Penina, what were the main highlights from what Wang Yi had to say?
Well, Robin, it was a long press conference. It lasted 1.5 hours, and during which time he fielded questions on various topics, really. He talked about the Gaza conflict, like you mentioned, and he did use that very strong language that you talked about there. He said the inability by the world to stop the bloodshed in Gaza was a tragedy for humanity and a disgrace to civilization. He said that China is calling for the release of all detainees and an immediate stop to all actions that are causing harm to innocent civilians. And he also mentioned that China really does see the only solution to this conflict as a 2-state solution. He said that it's calling on all parties involved to come to the negotiating table. The question of Taiwan as well did come up, and Wang Yi said that China will never allow Taiwan to be separated from the motherland. He said that China does believe in a peaceful reunification with Taiwan, and that the forces supporting the independence of Taiwan are the factors that are leading or undermining peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits. He was asked about the differences over the South China Sea, and he said those differences should be properly managed and resolved directly by the states involved, and that peace at sea should be upheld by both China and member states of ASEAN. He, of course, touched on China-Africa cooperation. The question, of course, was how China feels about the growing interest in the African continent by Western countries, and if China sees that as a competition. And he said that China and Africa have fought together, shoulder to shoulder, against what he said was imperialism and colonialism. And he said that China is devoted to the development of Africa, saying that that the development models should be suited to the needs of each particular state and not really a copy and paste, and that China has done that. But he also talked about the China-US relations. He slammed the US, saying that it has worsened tensions between the 2 countries. And he said even though there had been progress in the bilateral relations between the 2 countries, but that China, but rather US, continued to persist with the wrong understanding of China. Let's take a listen to some of what Wang Yi said in that press conference.
China believes in an equal and orderly multipolar world and a universally beneficial and inclusive economic globalization. An equal multipolar world means equal rights, opportunities, and rules for every nation. Certain or few powers should not monopolize international affairs, and countries should not be categorized according to their so-called strength. It is impermissible that those with the bigger fist have the final say. And it is definitely unacceptable that certain countries must be at the table while others can only be on the menu.
And so Wang Yi talked about China's commitment to multilateralism. He said that China is committed to the development of Global South. He said it is no longer the silent majority, but it is transforming international order, Robin.
Penina, thank you very much. Penina Karibe in Beijing. Wang Yi also spoke about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, saying that Beijing maintains an objective and impartial position and urged early negotiations to bring an end to it. On China's relations with the EU, Wang called for more cooperation, describing the bloc as a partner rather than a competitor.
这种三重定位
Labeling China as a partner, competitor, and systemic rival at the same time is neither consistent with reality nor viable. It only causes distractions and creates obstacles for China-EU relations. It's like driving on a crossing and finding the red, yellow, and green lights all on at the same time. How can you drive on?
中欧关系的
The two sides should be characterized rightly as partners. Cooperation should be the defining feature of the relationship. Autonomy is its key value, and win-win is its future. We hope that China-EU relations will move ahead smoothly with green lights at every crossroad.
Well, let's go to Brussels now and talk to our correspondent there, Trent Murray. So, Trent, how has the EU reacted to this?
Well, Robin, we know, of course, this was a really important and quite a wide-sweeping press conference by Wang Yi, one that was really closely watched here by Brussels, I have to say, just given the importance of the relationship between the EU and China, the amount of trade and commerce taking place between these two major economic powers just continues to grow. In fact, $2.3 billion worth of trade happens every single day between EU and China. And for that reason, what happens at that two sessions is really important here to officials in Brussels. Now, at the midday press conference here, I was able to ask a question of Nabila Mazraoui. Now, she's the EU spokesperson for foreign affairs and security. And specifically, I asked her around that statement made by Wang Yi, the fact that labelling China as a systemic rival and competitor is not consistent with reality or viable. What she had to say was that EU-China relations have become unbalanced in her view. She said the EU must ensure a level playing field and make a competition fairer. She said that is why the EU is reducing critical dependencies and vulnerabilities, including in its supply chains, and de-risking those supply chains where necessary. But she said, and I think this is crucial, at the same time the EU continues to pursue cooperation with China on global issues such as climate change, ready for, especially for developing countries, sustainable finance and bilateral issues. I will also just briefly mention, because I know coming up in the program we're going to talk about that major announcement of more European countries being given visa-free access to China, including 5 EU members. I asked the EU whether any reciprocal arrangements could potentially be in the pipeline. She said she didn't want to comment on any hypotheticals regarding the Schengen zone, but Brussels has certainly taken note by that quite major announcement by Beijing.
Trent, thank you very much. Our correspondent Trent Murray in Brussels. A Russian missile strike narrowly missed Ukraine's President Zelensky and Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis as they visited the port of Odessa. The two leaders were a few hundred meters away when the missile hit port facilities. 5 people were killed. Russia said it was targeting a hangar where naval drones were being kept. The top military commander of Ukraine said Kyiv aims to conduct a counter-offensive later in the year. After months of stable front lines, Ukrainian troops suffered a setback in February when the eastern city of Avdiivka fell to Russia. It comes as a senior Russian officer warned that the conflict could escalate into a full-scale war in Europe, and the probability of Moscow's forces becoming involved in a new conflict is increasing significantly. EU Conservatives have voted overwhelmingly to endorse Ursula von der Leyen's bid for a second 5-year term at the helm of the bloc's powerful Commission. Von der Leyen's nomination was sealed at a gathering of her centre-right European People's Party in Romania's capital, Bucharest. The endorsement places her as the front-runner for another term as Commission President, which will be decided after June's EU parliamentary elections. You're watching CGTN, still ahead. On World Book Day, we talk to an illustrator who wants to use her palette to help children understand the world.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty.
The green transition has to happen. It's a necessity.
Well, China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us is much more than what divides us. And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliette Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us, excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
This is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
The National People's Congress, China's top legislature, and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the country's advisory body, convened their annual sessions in Beijing. Lawmakers and advisors will assess the country's performance, craft laws and refine policies that will chart the course of China's ongoing modernization drive. Join us as we bring you highlights and analysis of China's agenda in our special coverage of the two sessions here on CGTN.
Welcome back. A reminder of our headlines. Foreign Minister Wang Yi says China wants to be a force for peace, but says the world's inability to stop the bloodshed in Gaza is a disgrace for civilization. Wang Yi also calls for more cooperation with the European Union, describing the bloc as a partner rather than a competitor. Hamas says it has left ceasefire negotiations in Cairo without an agreement, as talks were postponed until next week. Israel did not attend the meeting, which had attempted to secure a 6-week pause in fighting before the Muslim holy month of Ramadan starts on Sunday. Gaza's health ministry says at least 20 people have died of malnutrition and dehydration due to the lack of food. Humanitarian agencies have accused Israel of consistently and groundlessly blocking their operations into Gaza. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Noor Harazin, who's in Gaza's southern city of Rafah. So, Noor, it looks like there's no sign of a ceasefire before Ramadan. What's the latest where you are? What's been happening?
Well, yes, it is 153 days of this Israeli war on the coastal enclave. Fighting here continues on the ground in Gaza. Most of the Israeli strikes and attacks over the past 24 hours were actually on homes and residential buildings in Middle Gaza, in Al-Nusayrat and Deir al-Balah city, which is located in Middle Gaza. According to the Palestinian Health Ministry, dozens of Palestinians were killed during the past 24 hours. Also, a number of Palestinians were killed in an Israeli attack on the Al-Mawasi refugee camp between Khan Yunis and Rafah. Also here, the health ministry in Gaza received 47 bodies of Palestinians who were killed during the past few weeks, and Israel actually took their bodies, and today they released them by the Karm Abu Salem border. According to the Palestinian Health Ministry, 83 Palestinians were killed in Gaza over the past 24 hours, and this brings up the death toll here in Gaza up to 30,800 Palestinians killed in Gaza since the 7th of October. Talking about the humanitarian situation, I mean, looking at the reality here on the ground, it is just deteriorating. It is just going from bad to worse, even though there is more aid that is arriving to Egypt from several countries. I mean, for example, the Turkish Red Crescent sent around 33,000 100,000 tons of humanitarian aid to Al Arish city in order to be allowed to the Gaza Strip, but there is a very small number of humanitarian aid that is entering the Gaza Strip, even though Palestinians were hopeful, especially that we are only a few days away from the holy month of Ramadan. They were hopeful that more aid will be allowed to Gaza, that maybe Hamas and Israel will reach a ceasefire. However, reading what is happening on the ground, it looks like there will be no ceasefire or a truce agreement coming in the next few days.
Noor, thank you very much. Our correspondent Noor Harazin in Rafah. The families of Israeli hostages being held in Gaza have again appealed to the international community for support. Speaking at a press conference in London, the families say they can't afford to wait any longer to get their relatives out. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Sarah Coates, who's in Jerusalem. Sarah, this visit by the families of these hostages comes after the visit by the Israeli minister Benny Gantz to London. What have these families been saying?
Hello there. British Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron, you mentioned there that meeting there with the War Cabinet member Benny Gantz. He says that he had a tough but necessary conversation with Benny Gantz, telling him that Israel needs to get more aid into the Gaza Strip, saying that in February, only half of the amount of aid went in as it did in January. He says that under international law, an occupying power has the duty to ensure food and medical supplies to the population under its control. Now, with regards to these hostage families holding that press conference in the UK just a short while ago, these people are absolutely fed up. They are furious and they are worried. They fear that this last round of hostage negotiations, which we do actually hear could still be ongoing, they fear that it is potentially the last chance to get their loved ones out. And they're very worried about these continued demands by the Israeli government, this demand in particular for Hamas to give a list over of these hostages that do remain alive in the Strip, which Hamas refused, saying that this is something that it simply cannot do because of Israel's bombing campaign and because it doesn't know where these hostages are and actually which ones are alive. So this is, of course, very concerning for these families. Here's one person, what they said just a little earlier.
How you can sleep at night? Look at us. Look at them. All the time. Keep them in the top of the agenda. Keep them in the top of everything. They must come home now. Immediately now. We want them alive. And we also need the ones that are not alive anymore. Everyone got to return home, and they don't have time to wait.
And Sarah, there's been condemnation of Israel after it approved plans for over 3,000 new settlers' homes in the West Bank.
Definitely. These are the first plans to be approved since June. Sharp condemnation from right around the world: Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and also Germany, which says that it strongly condemns these plans, asking Israel to withdraw them. We also heard from the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He is calling the move illegal, disappointing, and counterproductive to achieving enduring peace. Now, you may remember this attack just last month, just outside the settlement of Ma'ale Adumim. This is around 10 kilometres east of where I'm standing now. A number of Palestinian gunmen, they got out of their car, they shot a number of settlers who were waiting to go through a checkpoint. And it was after this attack that we heard from the far right here in Israel, specifically the Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. He said that more settlement housing would now go ahead. He posted on X, "The enemies try to hurt and weaken, but we continue to build in this country." Now, it is important to say that the majority of this settlement housing will actually be in that settlement of Ma'ale Adumim. And this is really causing a lot of concern, especially given we are now in the lead up to Ramadan. It is expected to fall this Sunday amid a lot of heightened tension here in Jerusalem.
Sarah, thank you very much. Our correspondent Sarah Coates in Jerusalem. US officials say 3 sailors have been killed in the first fatal Houthi attack on Red Sea shipping. The Iran-aligned Yemeni group claimed responsibility for the missile attack, which set a Barbados flagged ship on fire off the coast of Yemen. The Houthis have been attacking ships in the Red Sea since November, in what they say is a show of solidarity with the Palestinians in Gaza. The United States has called on Haiti's Prime Minister to move more quickly towards elections as gangs threaten to spark a civil war. A week-long rebellion against the country's interim leader, Ariel Henry, has plunged the country into chaos, with gang leaders demanding his resignation. Senegal is getting ready for the first round of delayed elections after President Macky Sall moved to end weeks of turmoil by naming March the 24th as polling day. Sall, who cannot run for a third term, last month postponed the presidential vote just weeks before it was due to take place. The jailed opposition leader, Ousmane Sonko, is still barred from standing. The woman in charge of weapons for the film Rust has been found guilty of involuntary manslaughter after a deadly shooting. Hannah Gutierrez-Reed was working on the production when actor Alec Baldwin shot cinematographer Helena Hutchins with a live bullet. Gutierrez faces up to 18 months in prison. China has announced it will offer visa-free entry to 4 more European countries from March the 14th. Hungary, Austria, Belgium and Luxembourg have been added to the list of nations that no longer require visas, as Beijing sets out to attract more tourists and business travellers. People from those countries will be able to stay in China for up to 15 days. Chinese travel agents at a trade fair in Berlin say they hope the move will give their industry a boost. From there, our correspondent Peter Oliver reports.
The ITB Berlin is the world's largest trade fair for the travel and tourism industry, held every year in the German capital. Among those pitching themselves as the dream destination for holidaymakers is China.
There are many reasons to come to China, but the most important one, I think, is because of its history in modern development. Everyone knows that China is a country with a long history, and Beijing is the city that best represents China's ancient culture. Beijing as a city has a history of thousands of years, and as a capital it has a history of more than 860 years.
In December, citizens of France, Germany, Spain, the Netherlands, Italy and Malaysia were given visa-free entry to China for 15 days for tourism and business. Ireland and Switzerland were added to the list in January. It's been a popular move.
Since the country announced this visa-free policy, we can see that more and more foreign guests, especially European guests, are becoming more and more interested in coming to China. I believe that we can see more people coming now, and in the future, there will definitely be more European guests coming to China.
From the sprawling, vibrant city life of Shanghai to an army of terracotta soldiers on duty for over 2,000 years, to the imperial splendor of the Forbidden City, in the sun, or even the very cold. Those specializing in bringing Europeans to China say the best way to understand the country is to visit.
I think it's not just about seeing with your eyes, because when you come to China, you have to see more traditional attractions, and then you have to enjoy Chinese food, and then feel the Chinese culture.
And for those of us who can't get a trip to China anytime soon, there is the next best thing. Peter Oliver, CGTN, Berlin.
Today is World Book Day, which celebrates the joy of reading and aims to give every child the opportunity to own a book. Yu Rong is an award-winning illustrator of children's books whose work tries to help children understand the world around them. CGTN's Su Xiaosha reports.
When they open the gatefold to see the Chinese painting, everybody would say, wow, that's a beautiful Chinese painting. So then automatically they will know, okay, this is how Chinese painting is.
That painting illustrates the theme of Xu Lin's Grandpa, the children's book shortlisted for the best illustration at the 2022 Udo Kate Greenway Awards, known as the Oscars for the children's books in the UK. In the book, a Chinese girl, Xu Lin, found it difficult to adapt to school life after moving from China to England. However, a Chinese painting drawn by her grandpa opens a means of communication between Xu Lin and her new classmates.
I'm actually really so fond of these kind of topics because normally, it's not in our daily life. But when I started to do these kind of books, let's say, for example, The Visible Sound.
The Visible Sound tells the story of a child with hearing problems trying to explore nature. Yu Rong said putting herself into the character was the way to success.
For The Visible Sound, what I did is like very early in the morning in the winter, I go to the Kan River because everything is silent. So I almost feel like I cannot hear. I did a lot of experiment, so just let myself feel if I couldn't hear, what would I do? How would I struggle? How would I try to catch the sound? And by doing all this, I would have much better understanding for everybody around us and try to be respectful and tolerant and to be supportive.
Yu Rong's journey of illustration was inspired by her teacher Quentin Blake, the famous British cartoonist who created the images for the famous book Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Her journey of art was further completed after graduation from the Royal College of Art in London. Later, marriage and the arrival of 3 kids determined her career as an illustrator for children.
Because now I have done children's picture books over 10 years, I discovered it is not just a book. Of course, it's a book for you to read, but you think about as a medium that children spend time with parents, it's almost like a family bonding.
Traditional Chinese art forms have been seen in most of her artworks.
I use paper cut. Paper cut is absolutely traditional Chinese folk art form. Gradually, I add more color in to be accepted by international audience.
So far, Yu Rong has published more than 20 books in different languages and in more than 20 countries around the world. She hopes her works can go beyond borders to help children who want to explore their world. Su Xiaoxiao, CGTN.
And finally, imagine going to sleep in a secret room filled with books inside London's most famous cathedral. For one night only, 2 guests will be able to do just that, as St. Paul's marks World Book Day. The cathedral's hidden 300-year-old library contains a collection of more than 22,000 books. It's the first time anyone has officially slept inside the building since the Second World War, when a voluntary organisation protected it from bombing raids. The stay, which will cost just $8, can be booked through Airbnb. The headlines again. Foreign Minister Wang Yi says China wants to be a force for peace, but says the world's inability to stop the bloodshed in Gaza is a disgrace for civilization. Wang Yi also calls for more cooperation with the European Union, describing the bloc as a partner rather than a competitor. And hopes fade for a Gaza ceasefire before Ramadan as negotiations are suspended. Hamas and Israel blame each other for the stalemate. And that is The World Today. Thanks for watching. We're back with more news at the top of the hour. Coming up next, it's World Insight. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.